Okay, my name's Ed Bottoms. I'm head of archives, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Nicholas Simcik Arese, who will be giving a talk entitled Towards Architectural Freedom. Nick joined us about 6 months ago as chair of History and Theory, but in the best possible way, it seems to have been much longer. He's already so much part of the fabric of the AA, really. And indeed, his intellectual generosity, warmth, and sheer willingness to discuss and engage with everyone is very much appreciated here. Prior to the AA, Nick was an assistant professor of global urban studies at the University of Cambridge and a research affiliate in the Department of Anthropology at Oxford. His specialism is as an ethnographer and architect, combining economic anthropology and legal geography to understand how people repurpose planned cities. His monograph on the political creativity of squatters in suburban Cairo and an edited volume entitled Experimental Properties are forthcoming. However, tonight, Nick will be discussing the PhD open seminar that he's run this past term, which examines past and future and potential connections between the AA and the Warburg Institute, ahead of an exhibition that's being held in the AA Gallery from the 19th of January. So I introduce you to Nick Simcik.
Thanks, Ed. Hello, everyone. So nice to finally meet you. I love the elliptical layout. I feel surrounded. But it's very appropriate for today, for the Warburg, because the ellipse is central for the connection between the Warburg and the AA. So, is the sound okay? Yeah? I like to speak up, so I'm going to move it a little bit back. I'm Nick. I'm one of 2 new chairs of history and theory here, along with Rosie Head over there. I did diploma here. I came back because I've always found that this place allows for a certain freedom. Of all the institutions I've had the privilege of belonging to, it is through association that I felt the most empowered to be imaginative. Maybe some of you feel the same way. So I was thrilled when Ingrid and Manije approached me with the possibility of contributing to an exhibition on maquettes produced at Aarhus in Norway of the Warburg Institute this January. The event builds up to the Warburg Renaissance Project, a reopening of the library in May, a complete refurbishment. It's very, very exciting that I think everyone should be aware of and put in their calendar. I've long noticed affinities between the AA and the Warburg Institute. These chimerical hubs of Bloomsbury are purposefully imaginative spaces with peculiar institutional arrangements and unusually loyal followings, outsiders sustaining deep influence. Both have near mythical reputations for original thinking on those feisty siblings of art and architecture. Let's take this intuition very, very seriously today. No better setting than at an AGM. Allow me to briefly indulge in the ethnographic fixation for intensely staring in the mirror at the obvious, that which can be taken for granted, as I attempt to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. What does the word association really mean? The 2 definitions are quite distinct: a group of people organized for a joint purpose, a mental connection between things. The AA and Warburg are both known for this word association, but each for a different aspect. Many have passed through both of our doors, leaving their mark and clearly benefiting from a mutual sense that there is some leeway, a bit of protection and encouragement to be creative with ways of thinking about worlds. And across our unit system, that archipelago of intergenerational languages for space, it is not uncommon to see briefs invoking the Warburg. What is the slippage between 2 modes of association? One seems social, the other conceptual. But what is in the gap between them? From this preoccupation, I've been convening an informal reading group this term, the AAxWarburg seminars, to refine the registers and principles through which so many find the Warburg fruitful for rethinking the relationship between ideas and images, and what this says about the AA and our relationship to buildings. A premise: both spaces associate as forms of freedom. A social association as creative freedom through protection and resources of solidarity, a stake and legitimacy, and a sense of purpose and mutual validation. And two, a conceptual association as creative freedom through linking across disciplines, geographies, and time, the Warburg. The thesis I hope to develop today is that resonances exist because you really can't have one without the other. That this is so obvious as to be everywhere, hidden in plain sight, an intrinsic duality between the social and the conceptual we all automatically somehow endorse. Once established, I propose a preposterously ambitious agenda. By defining the nature of this duality, one may sketch a framework for a new ethics of architecture and freedom, perhaps offering the seed for practically revaluing the good city. Let me explain. In December 1927, in Hamburg, AAxWarburg started to compose a picture atlas named the Mnemoscene. It consisted of 40 wooden panels covered with black cloth, on which were pinned nearly 1,000 pictures from books, magazines, newspapers, and other bric-a-brac sources. Pictures were arranged according to different themes by association, so sort of unusual hierarchy that ranges from sort of vehicles of tradition to sort of Greek themes, Nike, sort of not really necessarily in a hierarchical coherence, right? An emergence of antiquity might sort of include Nike, but here it doesn't. Warburg fixated on deep human impulses that continuously reappear across artistic expression, particularly the themes of classical antiquity, der Antike. Expressed formally in evocative terms, a way of showing folding tapestries, expressions of grief, or allusions to distant astrological symbols. He understood this afterlife, Nachleben, as artists tapping into humanity's pathological undercurrents, pathos formel, over which they had limited control. Each image reveals threads of human experience. Towards cataloging threads instead of names, Warburg turns his image atlas of remembrance, the Builder Atlas Mnemoscene, into a bigger machine, a library as thinking space, Denkraum, to surface further meaning by association. Along the way, he invents a visual science of human expression, Bildwissenschaft, transforming the history of art, the history of ideas, and the history of science by focusing on cultural transmission when previously the focus was on connoisseurship. In 1933, anticipating the void of fascism, the collection moves to Warburg Square, just a stone's throw away, incorporating into the University of London by 1944. Today, the library's notorious cataloging system, arranged by image, word, orientation, and action, looks a bit like this. Here you find medieval Arabic folios sitting next to penguin paperbacks because they relate magic and science. As another commentator observed, free association liberates us from the canon, and contradiction fires weapons against the logocentric mind. Thus, the Warburg Institute continues to be astoundingly generative for the history of ideas, images, and society together. The Mnemoscene and library can feel like a monumental charrette or pin up space, or crit sometimes. At least that's how my partner describes it, an art historian. Where even the most seasoned critic can return to become the defiant dilettante. In a 2012 essay, art historian and my former colleague in Cambridge, Carolyn Van Eck, asks, quote, "Can we speak of a Warburgian approach to architectural history?" End quote. Amid so much influence for images, why so few efforts to extend fascination with pathos, remembrance, and archetypes to buildings? Van Eck recounts that Warburg's heir, Fritz Saxel, presiding over the move to London as its first director, immediately saw architectural gap in the collection, perhaps inspired by the commission for a new library. The resulting 1949 work, in collaboration with Rudolf Wittgauer, British Art in the Mediterranean World, tours classical themes in British architectural ornament. The form is Warburgian, large format images juxtaposing across periods and places a la Mnemoscene. But they fumble physicality as domain for ideas. As we say in Italian, traduttore, traditore, translator, traitor. Here buildings flatten into facadism, into images. Efforts are largely abandoned, focus returning to imagery, and the Warburg's current catalog for images on architecture looks a bit like this. A straightforward roster of countries, cities, perhaps buildings if the city is particularly important. The material, spatial, the problem of function versus experience remain opaque to the project of social cultural transmission. Yet, as Van Eyck reminds in Alberti's prologue to De Re Edificatoria, he states, architecture is not only the setting for civic life, it also provides stone monuments to keep the collective memory of society alive. How can it be that an entire tradition and culture of understanding the image, so widely influential, so inspiring to architects within and beyond the AA, that is premised on associations derived from specifically mapping this catalog onto plan and section, image, action, word, and orientation, a specific building as a Denkraum, a thinking space, struggles to theoretically incorporate architecture? That's what we've been asking in a sitting room turned studio at 33 Bedford Square, circumventing the pitfalls of translation between art and architecture. We dig down to infer principles for transposition. Here you see somehow the distribution. I don't know if you can read, but it's just a list of countries and cities. You can see the dominance of Italy in blue, France in second place, UK in third in black, France is yellow. The so-called sort of global south is green, and then my other home of the US is the pink in the corner. So there's a crucial anthropological observation in Van Eyck's piece. Free to associate across disciplines, the dilettante Warburg's ultimate impulse questions the idea of artistic freedom. He rejected the notion that history is made by sudden flashes of enlightened genius, charging imagery through mastery alone, and therefore that the historian's job was just a list, cataloging exceptional creators, divine and detached. He aimed a deathly blow at the projection of the liberal age's obsession with individualism onto the past. Instead, for Warburg, the great talents invariably channel meaning through technical mastery, reinventing enduring formal impulses. They channel, they reinvent. The threads of culture billow across time, grasped for a moment through agency borrowed by the master. Virtuosity is crucial, but only as a vehicle for rekindling the fire of deeper impulses, crises, ecstasies. From here, another kind of freedom takes shape in the relationship between image and artist. The artist is not like a divine creator working ex nihilo. She is free to interpret by transmission from images onto creator across generations. Warburg's Denkraum channels the locus for this artistic freedom, concentrating a forum where art is agent to shape culture. Like a power plant in the Denkraum, the current for which charged objects act as conduits is social memory. Quote from Abby Warburg, when I look back on my life's journey, it seems that my function has been to serve as a seismograph, to be placed along the dividing lines between different cultural atmospheres and systems. How do anthropologists understand this current of social memory and its relationship to a non-individualistic notion of freedom, perhaps? What are the operations and logics of virtuosic things? In the Chimera principle, Carl Savary grapples with the precise mechanics of social memory and transmission. For Savary, division of all culture into two forms of knowledge transmission, written and oral, is a critical fallacy, obscuring the social construction of meaning over time. Across all communicative traditions, imagery is always paramount, as the continuum between the oral and the written. This is evident in memorization techniques, mnemotechnics, and the associated objects across the world. For Savary, Warburg intuited that no memory is outside of a narrative structure, that storytelling involves rituals, reconfiguring a temporal experience. Warburg left psychology studies in Berlin in 1891 to travel with the US with anthropologist Franz Boas in 1895, visiting the Hopi in Arizona. His goal, defining the elements of a, quote, psychology of human expression. Warburg fixates on drawings of lightning snakes in Arizona, a reoccurring icon, both in Hopi mnemotechnical devices and in children's drawings. Each representation carried enough similarity to consistently convey specific historical and geographical meaning, but always with degrees of narrative and visual variation. He conceives here, quote, the transmission of symbols, end quote. By comparing traces in Indian astrology he identifies in Francesco della Rosa's 15th century month of March in Palazzo Schifanoia, directly with the Hopi snake. Both involve visual motifs passing within and across cultures over centuries, a dormant potential awakened by artists. While one exhibits realism, the other abstraction, they are not in opposition for Warburg, crucially. The former imitates the eye, a monofocal act. The latter faithfully portrays what is represented by the mind, a stereoscopic reconciliation of perception's internal and external faculties. The primitive, so-called primitive, is neither, quote, neither naive nor rudimentary, he tells us. It chooses to construct complexity where our own eyes are accustomed to simplifying. Warburg deduces that rendering form is a deep human impulse, requiring an evolutionarily innate, quote, visual empathy, a constant production of mental images to accompany perception, a constant, imperceptible, wakeful dreaming. Images for transmission of social memory may transmit coherently, objectively, but always also involve imaginative projection. Subjective imagination invites decodification, which is collectively then coherent. Therefore, the faculties of memory and imagination are cyclically inseparable to form chains of ideas. This is most explicit in chimera, imaginative hybrid animals that are ever present across global iconography and mnemotechnical devices, often more effective than writing to convey complex cartographic, topological, kinship, or historical knowledge. The iconography contains, quote, heraldic skeletons, conventionalizations of lightning snake, as well as heterogeneity of conveyance to render it memorable, a child's ever more imaginative expression. In the chimera image, reconciliation between oculus and the mind's eye is the gap where memory and imagination intersect, the space of associational recomposition and transmission. As a crystallized stereotype, the chimera is decoded by toggling between what is recognized and what is new. Whether ivory sculpture or bead cord, design induces this ambiguity toggle, a twofold mental operation of simplification and projection, oscillating between strange, familiar. The chimera's transmissional strength, its mnemonic coherence and imaginative potential builds with each link in a chain of associations, constituting a community along the way. Imagine a game of telephone, where conveying the truth is a matter of life and death. A game of telephone that you probably know from when you're a child, right? It would counterintuitively have to be especially funny to ensure memory in the individual and the continuity of sharing the joke. This is the way it works. If refined by a master, chimera images can accurately transmit 20 generations, for example, of names, provide coordinates for water and drought, while being necessarily originally beautiful to remember. Revisiting Warburg, Severi makes a breathtaking intervention. By defining the logic of mnemotechnics, he establishes the first general theory of human imagination. What is the cognitive basis for this mode of transmission? In Art and Agency, Alfred Gell provides a compelling theory for the logic of transmission between things and people. For Gell, too, art acts on users through technical virtuosity, comparing objects with power from around the world to recount people's, quote, living presence response. People reacting to art as if they're also people, entering into deep relationships with things that trigger love or hate, desire or fear. He argues that objects act on people through the logic of abduction. If inductive reasoning uses specific observations to form general conclusions, and if deductive reasoning uses a general rule to make specific conclusions, then abductive reasoning uses incomplete observation to make a best possible conclusion, less certain, but certainly innate. Abduction seeks the simplest and most likely conclusion from a set of observations, a where there is smoke, there is fire form of reasoning, evolutionarily innate, allowing humans to navigate risk and engender action. We all intuitively understand subductive power as perhaps the defining quality of great art, a work that engenders strong and, in the best case, uncannily similar feelings across otherwise unconnected people. forming a spontaneous congregation. When we lament jargony gallery texts, it's because it robs the object of this abductive potential. So here, the black circle seems to want to move to the right, we abduce. Or here, this hand squeezing a thigh, we abduce certain emotions of desire, potentially. For Gell, then, virtuosic images or objects are imbued with actual agency, whether it's a Congolese nail fetish or Velázquez's Rockaby Venus attacked during the suffragette movement and also recently in the Just Stop Oil protests. They have actual power to enact action. They have actual power to induce reactions like people. This is not a metaphor, he means it literally. They could be said to possess a degree of freedom, as people outsource forms of cognition onto and through things. They in turn may transfer agency to another viewer for specific ends. Within specific cultural systems, especially imbricated relationships between a group and cherished things could amount to a form of distributed agency, he tells us, an extended cognition that exists across objects and people. People find power in relation to networks of meaning as externalized and collectivized cognitive processes, the way you might relate to your telephone and Google as a sort of outsourcing of your brain. This is a thesis taken quite seriously by cognitive scientists and philosophers since the late 1990s. We're not sort of existing in a bubble. In fact, we couldn't exist in a bubble. We only exist through each other. Gell offers one brief architectural analysis, the highly distributed power of the Maori house. Here, ornament, motif, form, inscription, recounting ancestors and events are not understood as symbols. Instead, saturated over generations, they're indexes of a group's vitality, and the house accumulates as a future-oriented vehicle of collective power. Ancestors crisscross spaces, understood as the belly of ancestry, the joint force of a people's social memory, which is entered so that decisions about the future can be shaped and made, perhaps like this lecture hall. Living members are only furnishings. They will eventually be incorporated into the structure, and the house is renewed as a fractal body of community and generation pregnant with a people's future. This architectural agency by abduction is strikingly similar to anarchist geographer Piotr Kropotkin's history of the medieval Italian commune, as evidence of an evolutionary basis for cooperation and mutual aid. He cites 13th century Florence and Sienese planning codes where any construction must by law express, quote, the great heart of the commune, end quote. Like the Maori house, protection in the medieval commune is afforded by mutualism. Citizens abduct social memory through the virtuosity of architectural craft, what Kropotkin calls, quote, the most social of arts. In doing so, they constitute possibility and thus a form of freedom. The beautiful city is worn like a Polynesian tattoo to empower its citizens. Chimerical images carry memory and generate imagination at once, a conceptual association, and virtuosic objects impart agency by abduction, a logical association. What then of freedom by mutualism, by social association? In an unfinished manifesto titled Towards a Ludic Panpsychism, the late anthropologist David Graeber hints at a link between theories of Warburgian transmission and freedom. Within the mediation of objects that are at once paradoxical, startlingly active and to some degree unfinished, teasingly schematic, and their ability to perforce an imaginative power to fill in the gaps, he tells us, lies a link between creativity and freedom. In contrast to chimerical practices, Graeber notes that formal writing systems were only codified by state-orientated, highly bureaucratic civilizations, likely domesticating people's imaginative capacity for its dangerous uncertainty through rules and regulations. These, quote, utopia of rules undermine broader, minute, and everyday ambiguity toggles of life that otherwise can bind imagination, community, and political freedom at once. In effect, this, quote, these, quote, dead zones of the imagination, where bureaucratic logic replaces every form of dialogical consciousness, of play or care as valid social expressions, with the promise of competitive individualism. This freedom amounts to a right to survive, a manufacture of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and the supposed drive of the selfish gene. Graeber reminds us that the phrase survival of the fittest was actually coined in 1852 by Herbert Spencer, the great liberal theorist, to describe human history and ultimately to justify Europeans' colonialism. Along the way, as the value and techniques of transmission is lost, so are possibilities, perhaps, for cooperation and care, actual respect, not just politeness, to ground a new politics of freedom. Instead, Graeber channels Kropotkin. Associational spontaneity between people and concepts, facilitated by masterfully made things, generates protection and imagination in equal measure, base conditions for political freedom. The regular work of filling in gaps of ambiguity is an expression of free will, not a threat. Instead of freedom by selfishness and the ever more intricate rules required to sustain it, more playful association, conceptual and social, nurtures a different kind of security, a freedom that flows through others, not despite them. So Graeber provokes, quote, imagine we jettison the idea of production and consumption being the sole purpose of economic life and substitute that with care and freedom. We'd have care by association, a social affirmation and protection as freedom, and freedom by association, memory and imagination as care. If infrastructures of care are what give us freedom, then freedom creatively reconstitutes care by reimagining social memory. For Graeber, one cannot exist without the other. Can a building be chimerical, associating concepts and people in literal ways? Is there such a thing as spatial empathy on top of visual empathy that draws people together? The lost potential energy of buildings is certainly invoked when we lament heritage destroyed at war. Does a city not always induce an ambiguity toggle, so constantly that we maybe take it for granted? Strange familiar spaces. It resonates well with Georg Simmel's Metropolis and Mental Life, or Durkheim's idea of collective effervescence, understanding the unprecedented exhilarations of fin de siècle urbanity. Citoyens toggling between anonymity and familiarity. The promise of a city, after all, is that it allows us to associate on our own terms. Let's continue diving into the invisible obvious. In the past, when one spoke of architectural freedom, two possibilities may have come to mind. A modernist freedom of the individual architect to determine liberation by functionalism, such as Brasilia or Neom today. Or a postmodernist freedom of the individual architect to transform context purely by formalism. Think Gehry or Schumacher. Both are individualistic, both deterministic. Both invoke freedom as a mono-directional vector emanating from an architect's positive freedom from his hand, from his freedom to do something. And this freedom then is to protect inhabitants from a negative freedom, a freedom from something, a freedom from inequality, for example. But there's also a proud tradition, much of it from the AA, of pushing the meaning of freedom in relation to architecture. Let us just momentarily call them the AA anarchists here. Otto Königsberger's housing rights, a kind of rights to assets as a kind of freedom. Walter Siegel's self-built housing, accessibility of building as a kind of freedom. John F.C. Turner, the late John F.C. Turner, and freedom to build, social housing as a kind of verb, participation as freedom. And Colin Ward, freedom afforded by negative space, think kids and vandalism, reuse as freedom. Bedford Square inherits this social memory. Most emphasize production of space, extending freedoms to users in production. But all still understand the relationship between architecture and freedom as something a maker does to spaces, not as something spaces can do to inhabitants. For this, we must revive memory of a contemporary tradition of AAxWarburgians, with whom the AA anarchists inevitably must have been in conversation. Francis Yates, for example, a lecturer at the Warburg from 1941 and who taught here in the 70s. Alvin Boyarsky, who was supervised by Colin Rowe, who did his MA at the Warburg, and Mark Cousins, who was a research fellow in the Warburg in the 70s. We imaginatively channel this memory here, oscillating between the two groups, to yield an associational definition for architectural freedom as a freedom by. So here's a kind of working definition. The freedom afforded to people by buildings or spaces that actively transmit social memory via imagination, thereby empowering care in new forms of sociality. This decouples freedom from fanatical individualism, understanding the almost automatic agency of architecture to channel relational meaning and empower a more imbricated freedom. By taking very seriously the chain of transmission between creator, habitat, and maybe steward instead of owner, and the mutual security this entails, architecture might embrace a role as infrastructure of care, embeddedness, and therefore new social worlds. This is not a metaphor. Form, space, material, and yes, even ornament, designed with the express goal of becoming pivots for ambiguity and resolution between people and ideas. Designing for stewards rather than consumers adds links to the chain, ensuring that a building's agency grows, maintaining gaps between memory and imagination for abducting meaning, thus buttressing freedom. We all already know what this looks like. It's here in plain sight. Bedford Square is an architecture that voraciously digests and transmits its social memory. Spontaneous rituals so deeply ingrained in its staircases, corridors, and nooks by the repetitive marks of membership. It is a chimera that instigates imagination by dual association. A building as a vital, chaotic, beautiful game of telephone. A space that maniacally abducts, most evident and enduring nature of relationships that form here. This is why when someone returns, maybe after decades away, and sits on the terrace with a coffee, interactions always find overlaps, so as to feel like both days and epochs have passed at the same time. The smoke of conceptual association is enacted through the fire of social association, a sense of freedom that exists through one another. Can such a thing be designed? I think yes, actually, but only if learning from both the virtuosic maker of Yatmul mnemotechnics and the irresistible images of Velázquez, inverting how architect and inhabitant relate. Architectural freedom is transmitted by inbuilt promises, inciting shared anticipation by those who take the time to learn how to see it, to care for it. How could one value buildings accordingly? Practically, in terms of maybe even permissions, what gets demolished, what can't, even maybe how prices are someday tracked. I think a good place to start is by looking at its opposite, the hyper-bureaucratization of city-making. Let's take Graeber's dead zones of the imagination thesis literally as a good descriptor for so much of what is built today. So many planning rules are designed to rein in the calamities and indulgences of individualist architecture, laundering their responsibility, whether on behalf of a producer or a consumer. Ostensibly reducing risk, but actually just shifting it around for a cut. Urban managerialism seeks the impossible, to erase ambiguity, to fill the gap between memory and imagination with impact assessments. Regulations become self-fulfilling prophecies, generating the very anxieties they claim to mitigate against, while facilitating investment and corrupting social ties as £250 an hour advisory fees balloon. Could it be that the Pretz and Costas of the world, siphons of both social imagination and capital, lobby for regulations that they know require floor areas only they can afford, sensing how unpalatable it would be for anyone to challenge anything even remotely premised on safety, health, or access? Here, dead zone developers, relying on mega chains to subsidize loans, become captains of safety, while de facto blocking any new locally owned commercial spaces, real, often small, architectures of memory and imagination, care and freedom. Could it be that fire codes requiring double egress in tall buildings, recently imposed in response to Grenfell tragedy, despite the actual combination of racism, flammable cladding, and stay-in-place injunctions, secretly benefits builders of only the most extractive housing? The double-loaded corridor to connect two stairs also maximizes single-aspect units. Suddenly, all new housing is dorm cave over Tesco Express. The situation is so dire that the imperative to outsource risk and responsibility, to flatten ambiguity, is baked into the architect's very tools. Revit rules supreme, slaying chimera after chimera. Only seeing architecture through the lens of negative threats to people could kill it entirely, leaving only the vulnerabilities that the rules were supposed to fix. Instead of a self-fulfilling spiral of negative regulation, what are the benchmarks for imaginative ambiguity? And this is where we're still working in progress. But we might start with an ethical turn for a freedom by architecture and strategies to encourage associational attributes. Here are three sort of footnote inversions from enforceable rules to rewardable benchmarks via, for example, rule reduction. How one might, for example, shift legitimacy of ownership to forms of stewardship, emphasizing the obligations of property, not just the rights of property, thus imposing sort of a duty of care. How can one not only speak of nuisance, but perhaps speak of affordance, the benefits that a building attributes to its neighbors, a kind of positive abduction from the building? Instead of only talking about growth or its opposite, degrowth, what about talking about expansive versus intensive growth? Sort of the creation of chimerical embeddedness that we might find in improvised cities around the world, if they were only allowed to get on with it. Achievements might be rewarded by rules reduction and thus cost reduction for both architect and steward, slowly unraveling the self-fulfilling logic of dead zones. This reevaluation aims to nurture the idea that architecture's virtuosity is measured by its associational agency, by the intensity of its afterlife, not only in its capacity for storing wealth. In this world of architectural freedom by association, the generosity and beauty of a city are evidence of its society's health. Form and function become indistinguishable, and good work speaks for itself. So today I've attempted to sketch out the principles, ethics, and some practicalities for a mutualist or associational turn in the general theory of architectural freedom. This provides a crude framework to value and make spaces that draw together, to transmit memory, to alleviate vulnerabilities, and to catalyze social imagination. The idiom, God is in the details, is famously attributed to Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. However, the earlier version, Der liebe Gott steckt im Detail, comes from AAxWarburg, probably taken from Nietzsche, as a subtitle for his seminars at the University of Hamburg in 1925. Perhaps we've been focusing on details in the wrong way ever since. Perhaps the details are hidden in plain sight, not only within the cracks of this building, but within our very name, architectural association, as a verb, to associate, within the people in this very room. So I'm here to continue interweaving the link between association and association as a central principle for governance, learning, and research to channel our ancestors. We intuitively know that architectural freedom afforded by this chimerical building. Maybe it's an example for the world. It is our opportunity to care for it, as it faithfully renews our potential somewhere in the gap between memory and imagination, where the gap is the detail. So let us please mind it. Thank you.
Can I open the floor for questions, please?
I'm glad you raised the question of whether the Warburg heritage had an architectural dimension that was as yet unexplored, because at the big Warburg conference, how many years ago was it? 5 or 6, that huge conference that went on for several days. It was a question I asked at the end, and it did seem to me that there was already many hooks that one could climb up on. One, of course, is Vitkova's work, but how about proceeding from, let's say, Panofsky's idea of a symbolic form from Kazira, where he wrote an essay, Perspective as Symbolic Form. And it seems to me that certain kinds of spatial formulae and format, such as, let's say, the open plan, or Rowe's idea of transparency, virtual and phenomenal. Those have the potential to be something like symbolic forms in the way that Panofsky had thought of them. Are there some openings there you might pick up?
Well, that's exactly the kind of thinking I would hope my talk would generate. So, I mean, it sounds very, very interesting. And that's kind of specifically what we're doing in the seminars. We're trying to develop a vocabulary along those lines. So, we've been kind of trying to consider what a bow atlas mnemosine would be, rather than a build atlas mnemosine. So, for example, rather than cataloging spatial elements, for example, rather than cataloging by name or place or simply by element, for example, door, what if we thought of, or open plan, what if we thought of door in terms of anticipation and started cataloging spaces in terms of sort of emotions and pathoses, for example? That's the way we've sort of gotten there. But yeah, I mean, I think at the same time, the sort of openness is not always the point. It's the kind of it's sort of the imbrication, the density of space can often sort of generate the provocation that is needed. So by freedom, I certainly don't mean nothing, sort of just total sort of void. I mean density, and density, which gives triggers to think. So I guess it depends on how the plan is used, really. But I'm not an expert on Panofsky's idea of symbols, so I wouldn't be able to totally comment on that.
But it does seem to me that that turn around 1890, when Schmarzov defined architecture as the creators of space, and strangely, nobody seemed to have thought of space as a categorically symbolic entity before in those terms. No matter how much talk of proportions and shape there were, the figure in the building was the substantial figure of the building itself, the brick and stone and so on. The very fact of space being foregrounded in a kind of gestalt flip of figure-ground change introduces, it seems to me, a new area for, if you like, chimerical practice, because space is extremely fluid and malleable and volatile, and seems to me eminent kind of field for Warburgian examination.
Please join us at the seminars. That sounds very, very promising. We'd love to carry that idea going with the students. We hope to revive it next term.
When's your next?
Depends. We're in full action mode for the exhibition, so it's very sort of practical now, unfortunately. But thank you for that.
Thank you for this very thoughtful presentation. I feel a little bit as if I had in a 3-star Michelin restaurant having a taster meal. So there's an awful lot there, and I don't think I can digest it in one go. And it seems to me, I mean, there's lots of scholarship, a lot of fantastic references, beautiful pictures, and also a lot of affirmations. Some of them resonated with me. Some of them certainly provoked me and said, "What? I don't think so." So I would very much like to know how I can get more access to this very rich menu and read it, maybe have it in course by course, so that I can digest it slowly and then have an opportunity of having some kind of comeback with my reaction.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'll send you the little syllabus we prepared for our seminars if you like. But we've been teaching through the material that I've presented today very carefully and slowly. So that's really been the point. Today, in a way, represents an imaginative interpretation on my behalf of the conversation we've been having over a term. So perhaps because of the imaginative dimensions I've added to it, it's particularly particularly specific and imbricated. But again, we'd love to have you attend our seminars. I mean, I've operated the seminars in the most informal, horizontal way possible in the spirit of the talk, right? So it's totally open. It's nominally a PhD seminar because it's run as a graduate sort of reading seminar. We read a text a week, and we sit down and discuss it all together. I don't have to have read it beforehand. I read it together with everyone else. I've kind of curated it. And so we sit down in a space that's been so thrilling. We've had first-year students, unit tutors, PhD students, graduate students, all coming together where any question goes. And I think it's certainly intends to be open to the entire membership. It'd be wonderful if more people could come. It was advertised quite late. I think that's one of the. It only got on the sort of Saturday newsletter, sort of about a month after I started. So, but
having said
it's because I'm new.
Seminar, you have the odd second year there, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, we've got everyone. We've got like sort of 15 hardcore AAxWarburgians. Shin is one of them. But there's 3 units at the A right now who have the word Warburg in their brief. So Unit Dip 4, John and Anne-Sophie, Dip 11, Shin, and Davide Sacconi. I don't know which number it is, but they've also have it invoked. And then several people in media studies have it in their description. And so there's all kind of this pre-existing interest. The name pops up everywhere, and I felt that it has for quite some time. So I guess this is my little attempt to sort of understand why we seem to care so much about it.
I'm thinking what Cedric Price might have said. You know, he called for another brandy and a cigar. He'd have said, well, so what? Chance is a fine thing, and that's the important thing. The AA is this is a liaison dangereuse, you know, and go for it. The AA is notorious for that. So I love the idea of you joining, and for all the fire of the most dangerous affair, it'll end in tears. That's absolutely sure. Like all things like this, but go for it.
Thank you.
It's really well exciting.
I will. I love it here, and because I can do that. Thank you.
I want to pick up on this liaison dangereuse. I think actually we've been a little too monogamous for too long.
Oh yes, great.
And I think as many flirtations as possible.
That allows me to pick up. So this is one of a series of sort of unions with a different sort of small extraordinary Bloomsbury institutes, right? So I'd like to do a similar thing with RADA, with a small group at the School of Eastern Slavonic Studies at UCL called Fringe. Perhaps one with the Courtauld at some point. So, sorry?
Swedenborg and Blake. Swedenborg Society. Blake.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, why not? I mean, we could do Pushkin House. I mean, all of the incredible resources of within 5-minute walk from here are really excited to come here. I found everyone. People dress up when they come. They want to look cool. Everyone is super happy to build something, and maybe who knows? Maybe these seminars to test what the overlaps are could become eventually spaces for who knows? Maybe joint PhDs by practice or all kinds of little things. And in a way, also sort of practically, that allows us to outsource some of the logistical questions of what it means to host here, basically. Other institutions that already have a setup to do that can allow us not to do that, in a sense. And then perhaps maybe one day we could have sort of forms of temporary fellowship, sort of fellow of the AA, as representatives from this kind of confederation of extraordinary chimerical institutes. I think that would be really, really cool. And not to say, oh, come, talk about our architecture, to say, whatever it is you do, just the word architecture, what comes up, right? So I have a friend who's a sort of historian of Shakespeare, and he's very interested in the personification of walls in Shakespeare's, this is what he said, in Shakespeare's plays. So he'd love to come do sort of something about walls as people, for example. So that this is how I guess I sort of try to practice what I preach, sort of praxis, theory as practice. I hope to be chimerical in my teaching. And in that sense, I hope that my scholarship is always craft and not sort of a commodity.
There's theatre and dance.
Sure, Radha, 100%.
We won't stop.
We won't stop.
You've ignited something.
Thank you. I can't wait.
Or you haven't.
I think it's a subtext to this when I was looking for this idea of these chairs, because Mark Cousins has been gone sadly for a very long time, and there's no way of replacing a Mark Cousins. And I thought, well, then we need 2 or 3 people to come in and sort of do the thing I think Mark did best, which was be here and be open to the conversation. And I think both Nick and Rosie are exactly that. And out of those conversations, which I don't get involved in, I don't think I have to. I think that they have their own energy and they have their own direction. And I hope they digress. But, and I think they will, which is fantastic. Are there any more questions for Nick, or you want to sort of, catch him?
I hope I'm not backtracking.
No.
But you mentioned intensification, and that interests me a lot. And I wonder if you associate it with a kind of alchemical discipline of getting rid of waste, within the design process. I'm thinking actually back to the Frances Yates lectures, because she was raising issues about alchemical practice in her lectures.
Actual alchemical practices, historically.
Well, yes, but if you see it, you can read the texts, but if you understand design, you can see it as a refinement to liberate space, a sort of spatial reality, if you like.
I think that's very coherent with the message. Whittling down and at the same time intensifying. The intensive, extensive, there's so much emphasis. The debate is always grow, sort of more accumulation, capital wastefulness, ecological destruction, or degrow, shrink. But maybe it's about flipping it in terms of intensive growth and extensive growth. And the idea of sort of how waste plays into that is really, really interesting. This is a very sort of theory-driven talk, but my normal work is much more practical. I'm an ethnographer of self-built settlements in the Middle East, so of informality of slums, where of course you have enormous, almost alchemical resourcefulness that happens constantly, right? That one has to constantly have an ambiguity toggle between things of value and things of waste, and what counts and what doesn't, and that changes all the time. And then that certainly forms a sort of moral position on what good building is.
Intellectual waste.
Well, that too, why not? I think intellectual waste is jargon. That would be the definition. It's what it distracts. It doesn't allow the work to stand up on its own. It's sometimes the gallery text that kills the beauty of what it is. We should allow for that ambiguity. The gap is the point. The text fills the gap. Or sort of wordiness. And very often the language of a scholar is wordy not because it needs to be. It is because of all kinds of bureaucratic disciplinary questions where we have to get more points in publications, and if we use certain words, we might. So we're the most guilty of jargon and of sort of wasteful words, I'd say. Keep it simple. Thank you.